Welcome to our channel. Here we learn new ideas and improve our English at the same time through stories. You practice English without feeling like you're studying. So let us start. Abraham Lincoln is usually remembered through the biggest moments of his life. People think of the Civil War, slavery, the White House, and the tragic end that turned him into a national martyr. That version of Lincoln is so familiar that it can almost feel like the man disappeared behind the legend. But before he became the president who held the country together in its darkest hour, he was something much more ordinary, and in some ways, much more interesting. He was a self-made man in the truest sense. Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in Kentucky. Even though Illinois would later become the state most closely linked with his name, his beginnings were in a rougher and less settled world. His father, Thomas Lincoln, moved the family more than once, partly to escape land disputes that were common in Kentucky at the time. When Abraham was still a boy, the family relocated to Indiana and later to Illinois. So from early on, his life was shaped by movement, uncertainty, and hard frontier living. His childhood is often described as one of deep poverty, and while life was certainly difficult, the fuller picture is a little more complicated than that. His father did own land at different times, and the family was not living in total ruin. But it was still a demanding life, built around labor, practical survival, and very little comfort. Abraham's father expected him to work hard with his hands. Young Lincoln, however, was drawn in another direction. He preferred reading. That caused tension at home, because on the frontier, reading could look a lot like laziness if there was work waiting to be done. Lincoln did not love physical labor, but he loved learning. He read whatever he could get his hands on, and that mattered because he had very little formal schooling. Most of his education came from himself. He read not only the Bible, but also fables, essays, biographies, stories, philosophy, and history. He was especially influenced by the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, which must have spoken to him as another story of self-invention. By the time he was a teenager, Lincoln had already become the kind of reader who carried ideas around with him. He did not just memorize facts. He absorbed the language, argument, and the rhythm of strong writing. That would shape the way he later spoke and wrote, even if no one around him could have guessed how important that would become. At 19, he made an early move toward independence. His family had relocated again, this time to Illinois, but Lincoln chose to begin making a life of his own. One of his first serious ventures was a river trip to New Orleans. He and several others built a flatboat and loaded it with cargo to take south. The job took strength, patience, and problem-solving. During the journey, Lincoln reportedly handled a difficult situation involving a sandbar with such quick thinking that it impressed the people watching. It was one of those early moments that hinted at something people would later say about him again and again. He was calm under pressure and unusually good at figuring things out. That river experience stayed with him. Years later, after a lot of tinkering, Lincoln would become the only American president ever awarded a patent. His invention was designed to help boats pass over shallow water by using inflatable chambers to lift them. It never changed river travel, and it was never really adopted, but it reveals something important about him. Lincoln was curious about how things worked. He liked machinery, systems, and practical solutions. He was not just a politician who memorized speeches. He was a man who enjoyed ideas he could touch. When he returned from that early river venture, Lincoln settled in New Salem, Illinois. There, his adult life truly began. He worked different jobs, took on whatever he could, and slowly built a place for himself in the community. And little by little, the tall, bookish young man from the frontier started becoming someone people noticed. In New Salem, Abraham Lincoln became the kind of man a small town remembers. He was useful, dependable, and easy to like. He worked as a boatman when there was river work to do, took odd jobs, split rails, kept a store, and eventually even became postmaster. None of these jobs made him rich, but they helped him build something just as important at that stage of life: trust. People noticed that Lincoln was good company. He could tell stories, quote long passages from books and plays, and shift easily from serious talk to rough humor depending on who was around him. He did not drink much, did not use tobacco, and seemed to carry himself with a kind of plain honesty that fit frontier Illinois well. He was not polished in the city sense, but he had presence. Even before he held office, he had the rare gift of making people pay attention without seeming to force it. He also served briefly in the militia during the Black Hawk War. He did not become a war hero, and he saw no major combat, but the experience mattered. It added to his local reputation and gave him one more piece of public standing in a young and growing state. Around this time, he also began moving toward politics in a more serious way. But before politics fully took over, there was the deeply personal side of his story. Lincoln's emotional life has been argued over for generations, especially by people eager to turn him into either a romantic hero or a tragic figure. One name that often comes up is Anne Rutledge, a young woman from New Salem, whom many later writers described as the great love of his life. The truth is harder to pin down. There is evidence that Lincoln cared for her, and her death during a typhoid epidemic affected him deeply. But the idea that she was the one true love of his life has likely been exaggerated over the years. What seems more certain is that Lincoln was capable of deep feeling, and loss stayed with him. He later courted another woman, Mary Owens, and for a time marriage seemed possible, but that relationship faded. Lincoln himself appears to have stepped back from it. Then, in 1839, he met Mary Todd. Mary came from a very different world. She was from a well-connected Kentucky family, educated, socially confident, and much more at ease in formal company than Lincoln had ever been. On the surface, they may have looked mismatched, but there was real attraction between them. Both were intelligent, ambitious, and strong-willed. Their relationship, though, was not smooth. It had sharp turns, misunderstandings, and at least one broken engagement before they finally married in 1842. That marriage has often been treated unfairly, especially in the way Mary Todd Lincoln is remembered. She has long been reduced to gossip about her temper, spending, or mental strain, while Lincoln is cast as the patient sufferer beside her. The fuller reality seems much more human. Their marriage was complicated, but it was also real, enduring, and filled with shared burdens. They had 4 sons together, and they built a home and family life in Springfield, Illinois. In 1844, they bought the house that would become the only home Lincoln ever owned. By then, his legal career was taking shape in a serious way. Popular memory sometimes turns Lincoln into a clumsy country lawyer who somehow wandered into greatness, but that is not really accurate. He became a successful attorney with a strong practice. He represented important clients, including railroad interests, and earned enough to live comfortably. His home in Springfield reflected that success. He was not wealthy by elite standards, but he was far from a failure. So while Lincoln's public image later became tied to war and national crisis, these years tell a different story. This was the period when he was building his life brick by brick, learning how people worked, learning how communities held together, and becoming something rare. A man who could rise without pretending he had not come from somewhere humble. And before long, that same man would rise from local respect to national importance. Abraham Lincoln's home life was fuller and warmer than the stiff public image of him often suggests. He and Mary Todd Lincoln had 4 sons, and by most accounts he was an affectionate father. In fact, he may have been a little too soft with his children, at least in the eyes of others. His sons could be noisy, messy, and wild, whether at home in Springfield or later in Washington, and Lincoln usually let a great deal slide. That annoyed his wife at times, and definitely irritated his law partners. But it also shows something gentle about him. For a man remembered so often in sorrow, he clearly took real joy in his children. That joy, sadly, was mixed with grief. 2 of his sons died during his lifetime. Edward, called Eddie, died when he was very young, and later Willie died in the White House during Lincoln's presidency. These losses hit both parents hard. Childhood death was sadly common in the 19th century, but that did not make it easier. Lincoln carried grief quietly, often inwardly, and people around him noticed that he was a man who could sink into deep sadness. Over the years, this became part of his public story too. He was often described as melancholy, and while some later writers pushed that almost into myth, there is no doubt that sorrow was a real part of his character. Still, sadness was never the whole story. Lincoln also had a rich set of everyday interests that are easy to miss when all attention goes to war and politics. He loved reading, of course, but he also loved machinery. He liked to understand how things worked and had a real fascination with invention. He spent time studying devices, admired ingenuity in others, and even earned a patent himself, which remains a unique distinction for an American president. That side of him feels very human, curious, practical, and a little playful. He also loved travel. Railroads especially caught his imagination. He saw them not only as symbols of progress, but as tools that could reshape the country. As a lawyer, he represented railroad interests, and as a man, he genuinely enjoyed being in motion. There was something about travel that seemed to suit him. It gave him space to think, and Lincoln was someone who needed that space. Even later in life, he talked about hopes of traveling more widely, including Europe and the Holy Land, places he knew through reading and imagination. At home, the Lincolns also had plenty of life around them in a very literal sense. Their household was full of animals, cats, dogs, birds, and various pets brought home by the boys made the place lively. That detail may seem small, but it matters. It reminds you that the Lincoln home was not some cold museum version of family life. It was busy, emotional, sometimes chaotic, and very much lived in. Food was another part of his daily world that later myths often flatten. Lincoln is sometimes described as indifferent to eating, but the fuller record suggests a man with simple tastes rather than no appetite at all. He liked straightforward meals, enjoyed apples, had a clear, sweet tooth, and seems to have happily eaten oysters, pie, and other popular dishes of the time. He was not fussy. He was just plain in his habits. Music mattered to him too. Even though he could not sing well and did not play an instrument, he loved songs from his early life, enjoyed opera later on, and found real comfort in music. That part of him surprises people because it cuts against the rough frontier stereotype. Lincoln was both coarse and refined, often at the same time. He could tell an off-color story and then quote Shakespeare. He could love simple food and also enjoy formal gatherings. He was not easy to fit into one box. And maybe that is exactly what makes him so interesting. Before he ever reached the White House, Lincoln had already become a man shaped by work, loss, marriage, fatherhood, ambition, reading, law, humor, and private reflection. He was not a statue in waiting. He was a real person, complicated in all the ways real people usually are. Then the country's crisis found him, and the man who had spent years building a life in Illinois suddenly had to carry something much larger than himself. When Abraham Lincoln reached the presidency, the country was already coming apart. The Civil War would define his time in office and, in many ways, define how history remembered him. But even in the White House, he did not suddenly become some grand marble figure speaking only imperfect lines. He remained a man of habits, interests, weaknesses, and private needs. That is part of what makes him feel real even now. Lincoln needed solitude. That may sound strange for someone surrounded all day by soldiers, politicians, job seekers, and endless demands, but it fits him perfectly. In Washington, access to the president was far easier than it would be today, and his office was often crowded with people pressing for favors, positions, or decisions. When he wanted to escape the noise, he found places where he could think. One was the patent office, which he loved partly because of his long interest in inventions and machinery. He wandered there with genuine curiosity, looking at models and ideas, the way another man might walk through an art gallery. His other refuge was the cottage at the soldiers' home, where he spent many summer months during his presidency. There, away from some of the heat and pressure of central Washington, he could breathe a little easier. He often rode back and forth on horseback, something he enjoyed far more than the security around him did. Even in the middle of war, Lincoln still looked for small spaces where he could be alone with his thoughts. Music helped too. Although he could not really read music and joked about his own lack of musical skill, Lincoln loved it deeply. He enjoyed opera, concerts, and songs that stayed with him from earlier periods of his life. He attended many performances in Washington and even invited singers to perform at the White House. That detail matters because it reminds us that he was not only carrying military reports and political burdens, he was also still a man who needed beauty, sound, and moments of emotional relief. Mary taught Lincoln, for all the criticism she later received, tried in many ways to care for him through those years. She organized dinners, social events, and home life with the hope of easing some of his burden. She also made sure he ate, because like many overworked people, Lincoln could become so absorbed in what he was doing that meals hardly seemed to matter. Their marriage had strains, of course, but there was also partnership there, especially in the face of grief, pressure, and public scrutiny. And there was always grief. The death of Willie in the White House was devastating. Lincoln's sorrow ran deep, but he still had to lead a country through war. That may be one reason he appears so human to later generations. He was not untouched by pain while making history. He was wounded by life, even as he was carrying enormous public responsibility. Then came the end. In April 1865, with the war all but won and the Union preserved, Lincoln should have been stepping into a period of relief. Instead, just at the moment of victory, he was assassinated. He was shot on April 14, 1865, while attending the theater and died the following morning. That ending fixed him forever in the American imagination. The man became the martyr, and the martyr became the legend. But The legend can sometimes hide the person. Lincoln was more than a solemn face on a monument. He was self-educated, funny, curious, emotionally complex, affectionate with children, interested in technology, fond of animals, drawn to music, and hungry for knowledge nearly his whole life. He could be deeply sad, but he was never only sad. He could be dignified, but he was never made of stone. That may be why he still feels close after all this time. Abraham Lincoln was not great because he seemed superhuman. He was great because he remained so recognizably human while carrying burdens that would have crushed most people. He thought deeply, suffered deeply, and still kept moving forward. And maybe that is the most lasting thing about him. Not just that he changed history, but that he did it as a man who never stopped being fully, unmistakably human. All right, if you made it through this session today, that already says something about your discipline. This repetition and consistency combination might look boring on paper, but it is one of the most powerful ways to build fluent, natural English. Keep showing up like this, and your brain will slowly adapt. Trust the process. If this helped even a little, consider liking the video or subscribing. It lets me know these sessions are actually making a difference. We'll catch up again soon. Take care till then.